Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Donald Trump, as he ran for president, had a lot of language that sounded like he was against intervention. He critiqued Hillary Clinton's vote in favor of the war in Iraq. He critiqued her support for intervention and overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. He talked against regime change. Now, we know on both counts it was completely disingenuous because not only did he support the Iraq war when asked early before the Iraq war, but even more overtly, because he was a little ambivalent on the Iraq question, or ambiguous. On Libya, he actually called for all American troops in the Middle East to march into Libya and overthrow Gaddafi. That's what he said at the time. So the more kind of libertarian anti-interventionist rhetoric always seemed rather disingenuous. Now that we see who his foreign policy team is, at least as it is emerging, now we perhaps know what the real Donald Trump believes about what needs to be done. Almost everyone so far, whether they're the head of the CIA, Pompeo, or whether they're going to be retired General Flynn as his national security advisor, and all the various people so far being talked about for Secretary of State, the one thing they seem to all agree on is rip up the deal with Iran, and most people seem to think if you rip up that deal, you're left with, at least if you follow the logic of these people, attacking Iran. Now joining us to discuss what Trump's foreign policy team tells us about what's likely to happen is Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis joins us from Washington. Phyllis is a fellow and director of the New International Project at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. She's the author of many books, including her most recent, Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror, a primer. Thanks for joining us again, Phyllis. So, you know, what do you make? We heard some of this anti-interventionist rhetoric, but look at the team he's building.
Well, we don't know yet who's going to end up on the team. This is all still, at least most of it, is still uncertain. The one thing that we do know is that General Flynn, who was, of course, fired as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency in the Obama administration, has now been appointed as National Security Advisor, something that does not have to be approved by the Senate. He was largely by almost everybody in Washington in both parties viewed as somewhat of a nut job. That was a remark by Colin Powell was very similar to that. I think he called him nutty. And this is, you know, the one example that we know so far. We know that the people he's talking about for Secretary of State include people like John Bolton, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under George Bush, and somebody who, as you say, has been known for an extremist set of calls on Iran, not to just tear up the Iran agreement, but regime change in Iran. He's called on the U.S. to back an Israeli attack on Iran, or if Israel didn't do it, that the U.S. should do it on its own. So the extremism of some of these characters is quite profound. And as you say, it flies directly in the face of the kind of neo-isolationism that Trump himself seemed to be playing with in the earlier stages of the campaign, where he said he does not favor a move towards regime change in Syria. He does not favor a no-fly zone in Syria. He was not in favor of escalation militarily. Now, whether he meant any of those things or not is very unclear. It's not even clear who's really responsible right now in this transition team. How much is reflecting Trump's own view? How much is the view of Vice President-elect Pence, who may well have been given authority to make all of the decisions. We know that when Donald Trump offered the vice presidency to Governor Kasich earlier in the campaign, if he were to win, would he be the vice presidential nominee? Kasich refused, and part of the reason he refused and then went public, he said, he offered me to be in charge of all policy, foreign and domestic. One can only assume he made a similar offer to Governor Pence, an extraordinarily right-wing governor from Indiana. If he's calling the shots, we don't know what his foreign policy is. We do know he has a heavy dose of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment behind him. He may be the one responsible for these proposals. It may be coming from Trump's son-in-law, Kushner, who is one of his closest advisors and who likes these guys because they're against Iran and pro-Israel. So it's still very much a mystery who's calling the shots, who's actually determining what are the criteria for bringing anybody into these positions. But what we do know is that so far nobody there matches the early kind of isolationism that Trump had reflected.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. There's not a single appointment that reflects even sort of a détente or cooperation with Russia that was still apparently in his rhetoric as one of his more important principles of his foreign policy. But right. Pence's major critique of Clinton when he's out campaigning is Clinton's weak on Russia. Pence is as aggressive in that rhetoric as certainly Clinton was, and most of the traditional Republicans are.
Well, the one exception that we have here is General Flynn, the National Security Advisor. In fact, the only one who's actually been appointed so far and has accepted the position. He is, as I mentioned earlier, the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, fired during the Obama administration. And he has expressed great admiration for Putin. He took a paid gig with RT, the Russian television network, and went to do a fundraising gig in Moscow. The big gala for RT, sat at Putin's side and came back with great things to say about him. He's also talking about support for the Turkish president, Erdogan, this at a time when support for Erdogan is increasingly being seen not as a support for either the earlier versions of Turkey as an emerging Muslim democracy or the more recent views of Turkey as a crucial ally in NATO, but specifically supporting Erdogan at a time when he is really consolidating a kind of authoritarian rule. And he's come out in favor in an op-ed in The Hill, actually on election day.
There's an interesting thread between those two things. He gets paid by RT, and now there's a report that was in Haaretz that was generated by another news site. I'm sorry, I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. That Flynn was hired as a lobbyist for the Turk. Oh, so then go ahead, Phyllis. Okay, go ahead.
He wrote the op-ed on election day in The Hill, a very influential paper on Capitol Hill, that spoke of the need to extradite the Turkish clergyman Gulen from the United States, something that the U.S. has been very reluctant to do because Turkey has not provided any kind of evidence of his involvement in the failed coup of last summer. But it's in that context that while he has been in the private sector since leaving the military in 2014, he has had a consulting firm that, among other clients, has had a relationship with a Turkish businessman who has been very close to Erdogan and has himself pushed for the extradition of Gulen. So there's clearly a tie there between his financial interests, this was documented in The Intercept, between his financial interests and those of what he perceives as U.S. foreign policy, or what it should be.
Just as a quick aside, wouldn't that require Flynn to register as a lobbyist?
Well, one thinks that he probably should have. Whether he did or not, I don't know. I don't know that he didn't, but I don't think there's any indication that he was lobbying on behalf officially of the Turkish government. He was lobbying on behalf of a Turkish businessman and his interests, but he's a businessman known to be close to the Turkish president. So it's one of those carefully crafted arrangements.
There's a column in the Jerusalem Post by a lawyer who represents people who have been suing Iran. He's trying to get various lawsuits against Iran for acts of terrorism and other things. He writes that Iran has already violated the nuclear agreement, and critiques the Obama administration for not being willing to call it a violation. I mean, it seems to me this is going to be the path they take. This was about the amount of heavy water, and we've checked with Robert Kelly, who was a former inspector for the IAEA. In fact, we're going to be interviewing him next week. And he says it's quite nonsense. Everyone understood in this agreement there would be variations in the course of implementing it, a little bit of heavy water here, a little there.
No, there's no question that this is not grounded in some actual analytical assessment of Iran's actions vis-a-vis the nuclear deal. This is about raising sort of anti-Islam, anti-Iran hysteria on all sides. You know, it's not surprising. We're hearing the response to the choice of National Security Advisor, the choice of General Flynn, from David Duke, the former head of the Ku Klux Klan, who tweeted out, "Great pick. General Flynn's retweet shows he knows that the Saudis, ISIS, and the Jewish neocons are the real enemy." So, when you're getting support from the Klan for your choices for national security advisor, something that is not then something that has to be approved by the Senate, we're in very serious trouble here.
If you go back to the Republican convention, Rudy Giuliani, whose name is also being bandied about for Secretary of State, his speech at the convention was that the Iranians are responsible for terrorist attacks against the United States. Not the Saudis who are involved with al-Qaeda, the Iranians,
right,
where there's not a single piece of evidence that they're planning such a thing.
Right now, Giuliani seems to be off the favored list.
Yeah, so we hear, yes.
So we hear, but John Bolton, the noted neocon, is very high on that list. He's somebody, of course, who still says that the Iraq War was correct. It was the right move at the right time. He has said when he was, before he was made ambassador to the United Nations, he actually said there is no such thing as the United Nations, and that you could knock down the top 10 floors of UN headquarters and it would make no difference. He has blamed Obama's foreign policy for everything from the spread of radical Islam in the Middle East to Kurdish aspirations that have been in existence for 60 or 80 years, to the resurgence of al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. All of these things that are rooted in the Bush wars against Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's, again, a very dangerous move that these are the people that seem to be at the top of the list to represent U.S. interests internationally, to be the Secretary of State.
To go back to the point about who's calling the shots, we're going to be doing a story in the next few days and more in depth on this. But when Trump's presidency, when he wins the nomination, but his presidency is in trouble, his run for the president's in trouble, leading up to the convention. A lot of people don't even want to go to the convention. There's a Republican establishment is talking about bailing on him, just focusing on down-ticket races and so on, and he's out of money unless he wants to pour a significant amount of his own money in, and there's still some question about just how much there really is. In rides a billionaire named Rebecca Mercer and Robert Mercer, and they now install as CEO of the campaign for Trump, Bannon from Breitbart News and Kellyanne Conway. Both worked for Mercer. Bannon at Breitbart and Conway ran the super PAC for Cruz and also ran some other organizations that were under the Mercer umbrella. Rebecca Mercer is the person who orchestrates much of this with her father. And then you look who's on the transition team. You have Rebecca Mercer is actually directly on the transition team. Bannon, who works for her and her father now, is going to be the chief strategist in the White House with almost a co-chief of staff.
No, it's all very dangerous. And one of the things we're just learning now is that the latest announcement is that the likely nominee to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel will be former Governor Mike Huckabee, a hardcore right-wing force who has supported Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. He went in 2011, he was the keynote speaker at a dedication ceremony to a new Jews-only settlement in East Jerusalem. And he actually said at the time that Palestinian efforts to prevent new settlements and the expansion of Jewish settlers from building there was somehow comparable to racist housing discrimination in the United States. That the Palestinians were the bad guys here. They're trying to prevent Jews from moving into their territory.
Well, I know you have to run, Phyllis. Let me just ask you one final question. In all the growing opposition to the Trump presidency, and whether it's in the streets or whether it's Bernie Sanders and others, there's almost, at least unless I'm missing it, almost no attention on foreign policy, almost no attention on how dangerous this group that's being assembled.
Well, I think there's more now than there was during the campaign. I think we are seeing, as these names start coming up, when you start hearing about Mike Huckabee, you start hearing about John Bolton, you start hearing about Giuliani, all of these names, General Flynn, is generating enormous unease in the mainstream press, among mainstream political figures. So we're hearing from people like Colin Powell, we're hearing from members of Congress, and I think that is a very important move. What's more important, though, is that there are social movements that are out there. There's now a movement to stop Bannon, given his incredible racism, his pride in being a white nationalist supporter, that sort of thing. I think we're seeing much more now about the foreign policy issues than we have up until now. It has been, as you say, largely absent from the campaign and from the first days after the election. But right now, I think as we get to the actual appointments, we're going to be seeing just how dangerous these developments are, and I think it's going to generate a much stronger movement in opposition.
All right, thanks very much for joining us, Phyllis.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.